One of the ways that imperialism is going to be impactful in people's everyday lives is going to be that deep impact that they have on people's ways of working. For example, the world economy increasingly demanded Asian and also African raw materials. Now, you want to put down here next to number one underneath the unlabeled sentence. You want to put, please, here that these non-industrial societies could not keep up with Western demand. These non-industrial societies could not keep up with Western demand. So ultimately, this is going to be an economic motivation for imperialism because you have such an overwhelming demand because of the Industrial Revolution for these various raw materials coming out of Asia and Africa, that the only way that the demand can be met is if the Europeans go in and wrangle the situation. In these places, subsistence farming is going to diminish. Artisans are also going to be largely displaced by manufactured goods. Again, with this, not a lot different going on here than was going on in the Western world with industrialization. Many of these colonial states are going to demand unpaid labor on public projects, like for the example, the building roads and bridges, that type of stuff. Again, you know, a similar thing occurs with the New World colonization with the encomienda system. Remember how eventually that becomes corrupt and it just ends up becoming a labor system versus a system that's based on agriculture and large scale plantations. The worst abuse of this is going to be in the Congo Free State, which is going to be personally governed by Leopold II of Belgium. You want to put down here next to A underneath number two, because this is going to be a big difference. And this is also the reason why Leopold is able to literally get away with murder and exploitation, just horrible things in the Congo. Do you want to put down here that this colony was his personal holding. This colony was his personal holding. Like he owned it. The Belgian government had no say in it until well into the 20th century, until 1911, give or take a little bit there. But the reign of terror is going to kill millions with labor demands. This is going to just be in the building of the colony, let alone the forced labor that is going to cause widespread starvation as people couldn't grow their own crops because of this forced labor, but also because he's also going to force them to harvest rubber. Rubber is naturally occurring and will be amazingly desirable and also amazingly profitable. Eventually, here the Belgian government is going to step in and is going to take control of Congo in 1908, and they stop the abuses. Although the full control doesn't happen in for a couple years later. We also have a cultivation system in Indonesia, which is at this point the Netherlands East Indies, where you have peasants having to devote at least 20% of their land to cash crops to pay as taxes. Again, nothing necessarily that new from what the Dutch were doing in Indonesia during the early colonial period, forcing them to grow desirable spices and not grow things that would sustain them. Um, the proceeds here then were sold for high profits and financed the Dutch economy, and it also enriched a number of traditional authorities who enforced them. Really, here you just want to put down somewhere over here on the side that there is economic exploitation of the colonies. There is economic exploitation of the colonies. I mean, death factor of 9,412, but the Europeans are going to be using their colonies for their advantage. And everything and anything that they can get from those colonies, they're going to take, or they're going to manhandle and manipulate so they're able to benefit from it. Now, this is not to say that we do not have resistance. In fact, many areas are going to resist the forced cultivation of cash crops. Like, for example, German East India, we have a major rebellion in 1905 against forced cotton cultivation. In Mozambique, peasant sabotage and smuggling are going to keep the Portuguese from achieving their goals. So it won't necessarily always be a walk in the park or anything close to it. You will see that some of these conquered people will have some degree of agency and will resist the Europeans stepping way across the line of what's appropriate. Now, even though we do have people who are resisting, and we have people who are resisting politically, not just simply economically, but we also have those same people who will be more willing to cooperate politically, are also going to be more willing to cooperate economically. Like, for example, many people are very happy to increase production for world markets because it potentially is more money in their pockets. We have a considerable profit to small farmers in areas like the Irrawaddy Delta. Again, because it is going to be beyond just simply subsistence farming. It's going to be beyond farming for consumption in the immediate area. Now, with the Europeans coming in, those agricultural products are going to technically be able to go globally, which will give them, in general, will give them more money. Like, for example, although I will say that some of this is also going to cause some environmental problems because of over farming, because there will be some products like, say, for example, rice out of the Mekong Delta in Vietnam that are going to be so desirable that it's going to be over cultivated, which ultimately is going to result in significant environmental damage here as well. Now, just like we covered in the last chapter with the Industrial Revolution, we do have wage labor migrating. We have a lot of migration that's going on within Europe, not only from the countryside to the cities, but you also have emigration going from Europe and then out of Europe. And the same thing is going to be going on here within the colonies. And wage labor in general in European enterprises was very, very common. African migrants, for example, are going to move in several directions. And you want to put down here next to number two, do you want to put down here that this will be socially disruptive? This will be socially disruptive as well as economically disruptive, as well as economically disruptive. I mean, you have African migrants, not only continuing to be absorbed within the Atlantic slave trade for much of this 19th century, but there's also going to be internal migration growing within the European empires. Now, here's going to be the catch is a lot of these African migrants, especially that are migrating within Africa, they tend to be men and not women. So you already have a huge disparity in the genders because of the Atlantic slave trade wanting more men. Now, once the Atlantic slave trade will be over, you're going to have African men going to the cities or going to large scale farms and plantations because that's where the economic opportunity is. While you'll have the wives and the women in general remaining at home and kind of trying to keep village life rolling. The Europeans are also going to take huge tracts of African land and employ Africans as workers. Just to give you a little bit of an example here, you want to put down next to C underneath number two that by 1913, 83% of the land in South Africa belonged to whites, and the land that does stay with the Africans is the worst land. You're also going to be able to add to this in South Africa that gold and diamond mines are going to employ a large number of people, but in extremely, extremely harsh conditions. And this same thing or a similar situation is going to be occurring within Asia, where some 29 million Indians and some 19 million Chinese are going to migrate. They're going to work on plantations financed from Europe. Again, the same thing will have occurred within Europe. Again, here, harsh conditions, high deaths rates, nothing kind of new here. You even have the British facilitating migration of Indian labor to far flung territories of their empire, especially after the end of the slave trade. So, even though the transatlantic slave trade will end, although for quite some time you're going to have like this black market in slave trade going on, especially on Spanish boats, where slaves will illegally be brought in a very roundabout way to the New World. The British are going to create almost this system of apprenticeship within India that is only a hair's breadth away from being slavery. And that will really kind of feed some of the labor demand within the British Empire after the slave trade is gone. The Chinese migrants are also going to settle in other places. They're going to participate in gold rushes of Australia, Peru, and California here as well. And colonial cities, like I said earlier, are going to attract many workers. Just like in Europe, these cities are seen as centers of opportunity. However, again, just like to a certain degree, just like in in European cities, they're going to be segregated, unsanitary, and overcrowded. Although the segregation that is occurring within the European cities is going to not be legally based. And it's going to be segregated, or the division is going to be social, not racial. Where in most of these colonial cities, non Europeans are forced, they are mandated to live in specific areas of that city where the people are going to be packed in. You're going to be lucky if you get a decent sewer system. I mean, it's going to be absolutely disgusting. Living conditions are going to be horrible there. They also created a place for a native Western educated middle class as well. Again, these are going to be some of, how do I put this, some of the sons in particular of important colonial individuals, like sons of indigenous chiefs or people within like India or South Africa whose fathers would have some type of political position. The Europeans then will send those sons to be educated in England or Paris or, wherever it happens to be, and then to come back and to provide some support for the European ruling class. What this ultimately does is it creates an enormous class of urban poor that could barely live and couldn't raise families. And before we flip the page, you want to put a star there by D, because this is definitely something that we're going to come back to during the chapter on decolonization, because this is where you have a lot of men, husbands, brothers, fathers going into the cities to labor while the women are back in the village trying to kind of make ends meet. And, the spoiler is that they're simply not going to make ends meet, and they'll just become dependent upon the Western powers in a different way, even after colonization ends. Colonialism is going to impact everyone, especially women, and especially within Africa. Prior to the Europeans showing up in pre colonial Africa, women were usually active farmers and had some economic autonomy. So they have some economic independence. In fact, you'll see certain crops are going to be exclusively female, certain markets and market stalls are going to also be exclusively female. Like they're going to be run by women, the vendors are going to be women. But as soon as the Europeans come in, we're going to have a pretty drastic change. In the colonial economy, women's lives are going to diverge even more from men. So you want to go ahead and put a star there by number 2. Here, men are going to tend to dominate the lucrative export crops. The stuff that the Europeans really, really want, the men are going to be responsible for. Women, like I told you before, are going to be left with almost all the subsistence work because, again, in a lot of cases, large numbers of men, sometimes the majority of the population, are going to migrate to work someplace else, either A, cities where there's economic opportunity, or some of the large scale European plantation systems. Women, of course, were left at home to cope, oftentimes supplying food to men in the cities, because the men in the cities are going to barely be able to support themselves. In fact, one of the only ways that they're able to continue to exist, oftentimes, are by almost like these de facto care packages that the women are sending. However, there will be some benefits that the colonial economy will also provide some opportunities for women, especially small trade and marketing. Even though we did previous to the Europeans coming into Africa, you did have some women that were able to be important merchants, for lack of a better idea, or important traders within these small markets. The Europeans, because of them, especially taking a lot of the men out of circulation, women are going to find that they have greater opportunities within these small trades. Sometimes women's crops are ultimately going to have a higher cash value than what the men are going to be able to do. Women are also able to escape the patriarchy of their husbands and fathers. They're able to be a little bit more independent. They're able to exist outside of the control of the dominant men within their lives. Because again, these men just simply aren't there. They're either in cities or they're on farms. This, however, did lead to a greater fear of witchcraft and efforts to restrict female travel and also sexuality. You want to put down here next to D underneath number 4 that some of these issues remain after the Western powers left. Some of these issues remain after the Western powers left after World War II. So, kind of looking at colonial development as a whole, and before we get into anything, because this is a really important section, you want to just go and put a big star here by this section, because I guarantee it's going to be something that you're going to need to look at when you start looking over your review and that type of thing. So, the overall impact on colonial rule, defenders are going to make the claim that it jumpstarts modern growth, that these areas were so backwards that they weren't going to modernize or industrialize or have any of the things that the Europeans brought to them without the Europeans actually coming in and bringing it to them. However, critics of this are going to look at the long record of exploitation and limited and even uneven growth. Like I told you before, the Europeans aren't doing anything in these places unless they can get some reward for it. They're not going to industrialize them. They're not going to do anything to these groups, to these places, unless they can reap some type of reward for it. And once those things are in place, whether it's the roads, the bridges, the railroads, the factories, the large scale farms, whatever, the Europeans are definitely going to be exploiting the labor of those that they conquered. So it's not necessarily going to be all modernization, warm fuzziness. Colonial rule did help to integrate Asia and African economies into a global exchange network. I mean, they had already kind of been there to begin with. However, or they've been there at least, since the age of discovery. With Africa, as soon as we get the transatlantic slave trade going into full swing, they've kind of been there. This just takes their presence and puts it up on a different level. I mean, colonial rule does introduce some modernizing elements. They put in administrative and bureaucratic structures because, let's face it, the Europeans are having to govern. and they're having to govern oftentimes alongside of the indigenous population. They also are going to put in communication and transportation infrastructure. And again, remember, this is not because they're good guys. It's not because they show up and they go, "Wow, these guys need roads, bridges, and railroads. Let's give them roads, bridges, and railroads." No, no, no. It is all because that will benefit the Europeans. Now, there are some things that are far more benevolent, like we're going to have schools, and we also are going to have healthcare that the Europeans are going to bring in. Now, these two things are going to largely be brought in by the missionaries coming in this round of colonization, and won't necessarily be just simply because the Europeans come in and say, "Oh, hey, we feel bad for all the crappy stuff we're doing to you here. Learn how to read, write, and let's make sure that you have basic health care." And finally, here, colonial rule did not lead to breakthroughs to any types of modern industrial societies. Guys, you want to put a star here by number 4. And you want to put a note also next to number 4 that after decolonization, and we'll talk about this in a couple chapters, after decolonization, most of these former colonies were in shambles because they had become dependent on the Western powers for everything. What you'll see here during this period of decolonization, like I said, that we'll deal with in a couple chapters, the Europeans in a lot of cases are just going to, pat their colonies on the butt and say, "Hey, good game," and then they bail on them. And the colonies are just kind of sitting there without having any type of knowledge of how to exist from this point forward because the Europeans have been so good at cutting them out, really just simply using them for their labor, but not really telling them how to operate. And that's going to be an absolutely massive, massive problem moving forward. And we'll also go to explain why a lot of these former colonies end up being so incredibly and continue to be so incredibly underdeveloped.